My mother once told me, not everyone is meant to be exceptional, sweetheart. And that's okay, someone has to support the stars. She said it gently over coffee, like she was doing me a kindness. I was 19 then, freshly commissioned, my uniform still stiff with pride. She didn't mean to hurt me, at least. I don't think she did, but that sentence split me in half. It became the quiet soundtrack of my life. Every holiday, every visit home, I heard it echo in how they doted on my sister, the real success story. They never outright said I was a failure, but silence is louder than words. As I grew older, the silence hardened. It aged with me, clinging like a shadow through my 30s, when loneliness stings sharper, when you realize youth won't save you from being unseen. My sister's promotions were posted like gospel, while my returns from the battlefield meant no celebration. "You're always so busy," my dad said, as if I'd skipped a dentist appointment, not spent 7 months running black ops in places no one dares name. At Thanksgiving, my seat was given to a neighbor's son because he got into law school. I ate standing by the sink, my medals still packed in a box in the garage. That night, I told myself I was done. I wouldn't chase their approval anymore. I had survived enemy fire. I didn't need to survive the quiet death of being invisible in my own home. I always thought family would be my anchor, the place where you could return when the world turned its back. But sometimes, home is where you learn the sharpest lessons about your own worth. My mother once told me over morning coffee, her voice calm, her hands steady on the ceramic mug, "Not everyone is meant to be exceptional, sweetheart." She smiled softly, like she was offering me a life raft instead of a stone. Someone has to support the stars. I was 19. My uniform still creaked from its first press, the weight of its brass pins new and thrilling against my chest. I had just been commissioned, ready to prove something not just to the army, but to my family. I don't think she meant to hurt me. Maybe she believed she was protecting me from disappointment, from chasing a bar she thought I'd never reach. But that sentence carved itself into me, becoming a quiet, persistent hum in the background of every holiday, every family gathering. It echoed in the way they celebrated my sister, the one they deemed the real success story. They never said I was a failure. But silence has its own cruel language. It's the way their eyes skim past you at the dinner table, the way your stories land with a dull thud while theirs are met with roaring laughter. It's the absence of your name in the family toasts, the small but brutal omission from conversations that circle around achievements you were never invited to claim. It's not what they say. It's what they don't. As the years passed, that silence didn't fade. It calcified. It clung to me through my 20s and settled heavier in my 30s, a quiet companion that middle age makes harder to ignore. There's something about turning that corner in life, realizing that time no longer waits to prove your worth. When you're young, you believe there's still a chance they'll notice. When you're older, you understand they probably never will. My sister's promotions became family headlines, each milestone posted like front-page news. When she became lieutenant colonel, they filled the house with balloons and printed banners with her name in bold. They called the neighbors, they catered food. When I came back from deployment, there was no banner, no call, no one waiting at the airport. "You're always so busy," my dad said, as if I'd missed a dentist appointment instead of spending 7 months orchestrating black ops missions across borders no one dared mention. That kind of busyness doesn't fit in small talk. Thanksgiving hit harder than I expected. My seat at the table, the one I'd occupied since childhood, was casually handed to the neighbor's son because he'd just been accepted into law school. A big deal, apparently. I didn't argue. I ate standing by the sink, my plate balanced in one hand, my medals still tucked away in a cardboard box in the garage. They were waiting for me to unpack them, but there never seemed to be a right time. That night, I made a decision. I was done. Done chasing their approval, done trying to squeeze into a frame they'd already cropped me out of. I'd survived enemy fire. I'd survived missions that ripped pieces out of me that I'd never get back. I didn't need to survive the slow death of being invisible in my own home. There's a unique ache in reaching your middle years and realizing you've spent most of your life trying to prove yourself to people who had already made up their minds about you. You look in the mirror, see the lines etched from desert sunrises and sleepless nights, and wonder when you stopped being the version of yourself they were waiting for. Maybe you never were that person. Maybe you were never supposed to be. The silence from my family wasn't loud. It was soft, polite, the kind you can almost convince yourself isn't there until it stacks up, layer by layer, year after year, until you're standing on the outside of your own story. They never asked about the places I went, the missions I led, the decisions I had to make in the dark with lives hanging in the balance. And eventually, I stopped offering. The funny thing about being overlooked is that you start building your own kind of resilience. Not the kind they celebrate with speeches or framed photos, but the kind that lets you carry yourself through rooms that refuse to see you. You stop expecting applause. You stop chasing chairs at tables that were never set for you. My mother's words still ring in my head sometimes. Not everyone is meant to be exceptional. Maybe she was right. Maybe being exceptional isn't about who stands in the spotlight. Maybe it's about who keeps going, who keeps showing up, even when no one's watching. And maybe, just maybe, the real victory isn't proving them wrong. Maybe the real victory is realizing you never needed to. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with a grand announcement. Sometimes it walks into a room, quiet but undeniable, and suddenly the air changes. The shift is sharp, electric, like you've spent years walking in fog, and someone finally throws on the lights. It was just another command briefing. I wasn't scheduled to speak. I wasn't there to make an impression. I was simply sitting in the back, a silent observer, content to blend into the edges of a space that had never really belonged to me. My family still didn't see me. Not really. They had already written their story about me, and I had learned not to interrupt it. When the door opened, I barely glanced up. Another commander stepping in. Just protocol. But then he stopped mid-stride, mid-conversation, mid-everything. His eyes landed directly on me, and his posture shifted like someone flipping a switch inside him. He squared his shoulders, stood tall, and with absolute precision, he offered a sharp salute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a bell, "General Walsh. It's an honor to see you again." In that split second, the room didn't just quiet, it froze. You could hear the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of boots, the silence screaming louder than any applause. It wasn't for my sister. It wasn't for the officers lined up in neat rows. It was for me. The weight of that moment didn't feel sweet. It felt like glass cracking under pressure. Years of being invisible. Years of family dinners where I was a footnote. Years of being politely ignored. Years of eating by the sink, split wide open. The man who had once trusted me with lives stood in front of me, not just acknowledging me, but honoring me in front of a room that had been conditioned to overlook me. I stood to return the salute, not because I needed validation, but because I refused to let him stand there alone. His gesture demanded an answer. It demanded that I step into the space I'd spent years shrinking away from. From the corner of my eye, I saw my mother's water glass slip from her hand and shatter on the floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent hall. My father, the man who always measured worth in medals and rank, halfway rose from his seat before sinking back down as if he could vanish into the chair. The ripples spread fast, officers leaning toward each other, hushed whispers, confused glances. "Is that her?" someone murmured, the ghost from Operation Dagger. My sister Erica's voice faltered at the podium. Her hand, the one clutching her note card with practiced poise, trembled just enough to betray her. She searched the room, looking for something to anchor her, but the room was no longer hers to command. The gravity had shifted. It had found me. And the thing about gravity, it doesn't ask permission. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Some moments speak loud enough without help. The ceremony dragged to its polite conclusion, but the air was thick with what had just unfolded. People clapped out of habit, not because they'd regained focus. The tension lingered, sticky and undeniable. As the crowd thinned, Erica cornered me near the exit. She didn't congratulate me. She didn't ask questions that mattered. Instead, her voice slipped out in a sharp whisper, tight with something tangled between frustration and disbelief. "Why didn't you say something?" she hissed. "You let me stand up there like a fool. Was that your plan?" I met her eyes, calm but immovable. If you need the truth to shrink, you are never standing tall. Her mouth tensed, like she wanted to argue but didn't have the words to win. I walked away, the heels of my boots echoing against the polished floor. This time, I didn't feel the familiar burn of invisible eyes mocking me. I felt the confusion they left behind. Confusion is a powerful thing, it cracks certainty wide open. For years, I had been the family's quiet footnote, the one they edited out, the one whose story they believed they already knew. But the room that day forced them to reconsider the narrative. The cast list they had memorized might not have been so accurate after all. I didn't go back to my family's house that night. I drove to the base guest quarters, a sterile room built to host people briefly and forget them quickly. Beige walls, standard-issue bedding, a lamp that hummed faintly in the silence. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt something like victory. Instead, all I felt was the quiet hum of something beginning. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the fracture, the exact point where everything would either fall apart or finally come together. And something told me it wouldn't just be about me anymore. Sometimes betrayal doesn't arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes in a manila envelope left on a desk, silent and patient, waiting to be discovered. The envelope was sitting there when I returned to the guest quarters, square in the middle of the desk like it had been placed with careful precision. No handwriting, no seal, nothing to suggest who had left it. Just a plain folder, looking like it belonged in that bland room full of beige walls and humming lamps. Inside was a printed scan of an email, the timestamp from 2 years prior. No sender listed, no obvious trail. The subject line hit me like a punch. Reckless operation, civilian casualties. The body of the email laid out allegations against me, against General Colleen Walsh, accusing me of leading an unsanctioned mission that resulted in civilian deaths. The details were buried in redacted reports, the kind that rarely see the light of day. The message urged a fringe military blog to investigate the supposed cover-up, to dig out the rot within the command. It wasn't just the accusation that stopped me cold. It was the phrasing. Almost word for word, it matched an after-action report I had reviewed years ago, locked deep in a steel-lined bunker in Stuttgart. That report was only ever seen by 3 people, myself, the lead analyst, and 1 junior officer with limited clearance. Erica. The dates lined up. The brief internal investigation that had flagged me at the time, the random audit I was told not to worry about, it suddenly made sense. They said it was routine. They said it was nothing. But someone made sure the smoke lingered long after the fire had been put out. I didn't waste time. I found her later that evening at the post-ceremony gathering, still basking in the warm buzz of her promotion. The admirers, the handshakes, the safe distance from anything resembling consequence. I waited until she stepped outside to take a call, the air cooler, quieter, honest. I approached with the envelope in hand. Her eyes flicked to the page the way you glance at something familiar, but hope to never see again. "Did you send this?" I asked, my voice steady. No accusation, just a need for the truth to have a name. She stared at me, a long moment stretching between us like a wire pulled too tight. Then, without blinking, she said yes. I nodded. "Why?" Her shoulders sagged, like the puppet strings holding her up had finally snapped. "Because you weren't supposed to win," she said, her voice thin and frayed. "You left. You didn't stay and build something. You don't get to come back and still be more important." Her words didn't land like a weapon. They landed like something sad and tired. She pressed on, desperation bleeding through the cracks in her control. "They never stopped talking about you. Even when you were gone. Even when I did everything right. I thought if I could just erase you, maybe then I'd finally be seen." Silence folded over us, heavy and thick. In that silence, I didn't see the soldier who had just pinned a new rank to her uniform. I saw the little sister who used to trail behind me, begging to be included. I exhaled slowly. You know, leaking classified intel is a criminal offense. Her eyes widened, just for a heartbeat, before narrowing again. She said nothing. I didn't push. I didn't need to. I walked away, the envelope still in my hand, the cold night air hitting me harder than I expected. My fingers trembled, not with rage, but with something deeper. The quiet, hollow ache that comes when the blade in your back comes from the same hand that once helped you learn how to walk. Somewhere deep down, I understood her. That didn't make it right. Later that night, the base alarm jolted me awake. Not the usual morning call, but something sharper, urgent. Emergency protocol activated. High clearance personnel summoned immediately. I moved on instinct. Dressed. Boots. Comms. The halls buzzed with motion, officers scrambling into position. At the ops center, I was handed a thin file that carried the weight of a brick. A classified dossier tied to Operation Dagger had just been leaked onto an encrypted dark web forum. The forensic trace pointed to an internal IP, a dormant device that had once been assigned to me. Within the hour, I was seated across from General Hammond and two intelligence officials. They didn't say I was under arrest, but the suspicion sat between us like a loaded weapon. I gave them everything: comms, logs, full access. But something didn't sit right. I dug deeper, using every tool still at my disposal. I traced the digital fingerprints, pulled the metadata, and cracked the encryption layers. And there it was, the original email. The one Erica had sent had used an outdated server link. A link tied to an auto backup that triggered a dormant process, one that unintentionally attached a hidden file, a classified file. A mistake. A reckless, careless mistake. When I traced the logins, they pointed to Erica's credentials. She'd been at the base 2 days earlier. She'd mentioned leaving her laptop unlocked. The breadcrumbs were all there. And suddenly, the betrayal wasn't just personal, it was operational. This wasn't over. The next morning, I made a choice. I could have stepped aside. I could have let the internal security team handle it. But this wasn't just about protocols or breaches, it was personal. If I didn't lead this investigation, someone else would, and they wouldn't understand the fracture lines, the silences, the years of unspoken history wrapped inside this mess. So I requested to lead the internal inquiry myself. Unorthodox? Absolutely. But technically, I was still on classified reserve duty, and my clearance had never lapsed. I had the authority, but more than that, I had the motive. No one else would care enough to find the truth without burning the whole house down in the process. General Hammond heard me out, standing at the far side of the briefing table, arms crossed, weighing whether this was a mistake or exactly the kind of storm the situation needed. Finally, he extended his hand. "General," he said, steady and firm, "the floor is yours." The assignment was handed down. But the team he put together wasn't what I expected. The task force would be built from the inside, my family. My father, Colonel Roy Walsh, was assigned to comb through the old intelligence archives from past campaigns. Even in retirement, he still held restricted advisory access. My mother, with her background as a combat medic and her side specialty in biological trace analysis, was tapped to assist with forensic recovery from the compromised devices. And Erica, my sister, would handle the vulnerability scans and system access points. It was like walking into a war room where every player knew their part, but no one wanted to stand on the same side. Our first meeting in the task force felt like a funeral with assignments. My father opened with a clipped debriefing, his eyes glued to the screen instead of the people sitting around him. He spoke like he was reading an obituary, not leading a family effort. Erica presented her segment next. Short, cold, efficient. She never looked up. Not once. Only my mother's eyes moved between us, watching the space where her children used to exist. But we weren't here for sentiment. We were here for answers. And then, something cracked. While combing through the archival nodes tied to Erica's server activity, our security AI flagged a dormant Trojan, an old, hidden piece of malware embedded inside a logistics file from 2017. It had never been activated. It had just been sleeping, quietly tucked away for years. The date punched me in the chest. 2017, the year I clashed with Derek Glade during a joint campaign in Mosul. He wanted an aggressive sweep through civilian zones to root out enemy cells. I blocked him, demanded a phased containment instead. It was the right call. It protected lives. But it also made me a liability in his eyes. A weak link in his version of strategy. Derek Glade didn't forget slights. And he had once held temporary encryption override access for the campaign servers. If he'd planted the Trojan back then, it would have sat unnoticed for years, until someone like Erica accidentally triggered it by opening the wrong access pathway. The weight of that possibility pressed hard against my ribs. That's when my mother quietly handed me a folder. It was from the candle strike. She said, "You left this behind when you shipped out." I read it back then. "I thought you were hiding. Now I think you were just trying to survive quietly." Her voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't apologetic either. It was something else, something older, something closer to recognition. I didn't speak. I couldn't. She didn't need to say more. It wasn't a confession. It was an acknowledgement. The pieces clicked faster after that. Later that evening, our system flagged a login attempt, a remote IP trying to scrub the logs tied to the original breach. The location was traced back to a motel just outside Fort Campbell. The room had been booked under a false name, but the payment was in cash. The alias used on the reservation, Derek Glade. This was never just about Erica. It was never just about our family. Derek had been waiting for years, hiding behind the fractures we'd made for ourselves. He hadn't broken us. We had done that on our own. He just slipped into the gaps we left wide open. The raid on the decommissioned tech bunker where he was hiding moved fast. It felt like a storm front, a quiet approach, then a snap of lightning. Derek was halfway through uploading a compressed data bundle when we breached. He didn't resist. He didn't flinch. He just looked at me and said, "Took you long enough." In the interrogation room, he laid it all out, not with malice, but with bitter clarity. "I didn't need to destroy you in public," he said. "I just needed you out of the room. If your clearance was gone, no more NATO councils, no more front-row seats at strategic talks. You rose too fast. People stopped asking questions. I just showed them where to look." His strategy wasn't genius. He was patient. He exploited the cracks. He used Erica's mistake as his opening. He didn't build the fire. He just watched us set it and then planted his flag in the smoke. When Erica read his confession later, she sat frozen, her eyes locked on the transcript like she could will the words to change. After a long pause, she whispered, "I didn't know it would lead to this." I folded my arms. Sometimes we burn a dry field out of jealousy. We forget people are sleeping in that grass. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. But her armor, her pride, softened just enough for me to see it. This wasn't the end. But maybe, just maybe, we were starting to find our way toward it. Derek Glade wasn't the kind of enemy who kicked down doors. He was the kind who waited, who sharpened his grudge until it could cut without being seen. He didn't want headlines. He didn't want my public collapse. He just wanted me gone, quietly, permanently. In the sterile interrogation room, he sat with the kind of calm you only get when you've convinced yourself you've already won. His words weren't shouted. They weren't laced with theatrics. They were surgical. "I didn't want to destroy you," he said, his voice steady. "I wanted you out of the room. Stripped clearance, internal suspicion, that's all it takes. No more councils. No more seats at the table. People would stop asking your opinion. That's the kill shot." He had mapped it out years ago, how to use my own family's fractures against me. He didn't plant every step. He didn't need to. He just waited for Erica's mistake to spark the chain reaction. All he had to do was be ready when it ignited. "You rose too fast," he added, leaning back in his chair like we were just catching up. "People stop questioning you when you move that quickly. They stop watching." I just gave them a reason to look again. His strategy was brutal in its patience. He didn't need to push me off the cliff. He just needed to make the edge feel slippery enough that I might fall on my own. After the confession, Erica read the transcript in silence. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. But her fingers trembled as she held the paper, like the weight of what she'd set in motion was finally landing. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin, barely there. "I didn't know it would lead to this. I didn't let her off the hook. Sometimes we set fires because we're angry," I told her, "and we forget there are people sleeping in that grass." Her eyes flicked up, raw but resolute. She didn't apologize. She didn't have to. Some realizations carved deeper than apologies ever could. The next day, as we compiled the final report, Erica submitted an addendum. She took full responsibility for initiating the chain of emails that ultimately enabled Derek's breach. There would be no criminal charges, intent mattered, but the formal reprimand would lock her out of promotions for the next 5 years. She signed it without being asked. It didn't feel like a victory. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like gravity finally settling in the right direction. At the final task force meeting, we sat across from each other again. But something had shifted. Erica no longer avoided my gaze. She met it steady. Our father, Colonel Roy Walsh, stood to deliver closing remarks. His usual stiffness was there, but this time, when he spoke, he paused, his throat catching just briefly. "I owe this team an apology," he said, his voice rough around the edges. "Especially to Colleen. I let pride and medals blind me to what actually matters." It was the first time I had ever heard him admit fault, especially in front of a room full of brass. Erica didn't cry. Neither did I, but when I looked at her, I no longer saw the rival who had tried to erase me. I saw someone trying to learn how to stand on her own, without pushing anyone else down to do it. The morning of the Regional Strategy Conference arrived with a thick, low fog clinging to the base like a memory. Backstage, the projector hummed, and the weight of my name pressed against the banner stretched across the podium. It wasn't about legacy anymore. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about being heard. The room was packed: commanders, high-ranking advisors, officers who'd once parroted Erica's criticisms. I walked to the podium without ceremony, without escort. No spotlight. Just me, the click of my boots, and a lifetime of battles that no one had ever seen. I began simply. Some missions never get a name. Some leaders never get a plaque. Some battles don't start at borders. They start when judgment replaces understanding. The room leaned in. I spoke of strategy, but more importantly, I spoke of the moral terrain, the choices that cut deeper than enemy fire, the ones that follow you long after the battlefield is quiet. I disclosed a classified detail from Operation Candle Strike, the override order I signed to spare a hostile zone because 7 children were trapped inside. The decision nearly cost me my career. I would make that decision again. I didn't tell the story for applause. I didn't need sympathy. I needed the truth to stand, even if it stood alone. When I finished, I turned to the side microphone. To conclude, I said, I've asked Lieutenant Colonel Erica Walsh to share her reflections as a next-generation officer. She rose slowly. Her voice was not perfect. Her eyes shimmered. But her spine was straight. I used to believe standing taller meant you'd be heard, she said. But today, I've learned that real honor is knowing who you can learn from and having the courage to admit it. The room stood in ovation. Not for me. For what we had both just learned. For the first time, I felt the room see us both fully, without comparison, without erasure. For the first time, it was enough. A week after the conference, I sent 3 invitations. They weren't grand. No fancy letterhead. Just plain, practical cards with a date, a time, and one deliberate location, the old family house on the edge of Fort Campbell. The house hadn't changed. Same faded shutters. Same porch swing that groaned when you sat too hard. But this time, I arrived first. I set the table. I chose the seat at the head, the one my father had always claimed. The silence in the room wasn't heavy like before. It felt like a clean slate. When they walked in, my father, my mother, Erica, no one said anything. No pleasantries. No forced smiles. My mother carried a dish wrapped in foil, a quiet habit that somehow survived everything else. Erica's eyes flicked anywhere but at me. My father's face stayed unreadable, practiced. I didn't invite them to exchange apologies. I didn't need that. I invited them to hear the truth from my mouth for the first time. I didn't quit the service, I told them. I was recruited into intelligence. I laid it out, piece by piece. I told them about the 3 days I spent underground in Iraq after an extraction route was compromised. About the decision I made in Syria to shell a supply depot to save an Australian recon team. 3 civilians were injured, none seriously, but it put me under inquiry for 8 months. I told them I declined a medal for a classified relief mission because accepting it would have risked diplomatic fallout. They didn't interrupt. They didn't breathe too loudly. My mother's eyes filled first. Erica kept staring at her plate. My father sat motionless, his hands folded like he was holding on to something that might shatter if he let go. After a long pause, my father's voice came, so low I almost missed it. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I met his eyes, calm, not cruel. "Because you never asked. And if you had, I don't think you would have believed me. It wasn't meant to wound. It was just the truth." My mother's voice cracked. "I thought those care packages you sent were your way of saying sorry." I shook my head. They weren't apologies. They were reminders. Reminders that I still existed, even when you'd erased me from the family pictures. I reached under the table and pulled out a manila folder. Inside was the printed copy of the anonymous email, the one Erica had sent that almost ended my career. I slid it across to her. "I didn't keep this to incriminate you," I said quietly. "I kept it to remind you that words, even invisible ones, can be as deadly as bullets." No one spoke. The weight of that folder sat in the center of the table like a fifth guest. "I don't expect acceptance," I said. "But if we're going to move forward, it starts by acknowledging the person you chose not to see." Erica stood, slow, hesitant, and walked around the table. She placed her hand gently on my shoulder, nothing grand, nothing performative. Just enough to feel real. My father rose next. He crossed the room to the old shelf near the window, where the family photos were lined up in neat rows. He picked up a frame, a picture from a long-ago summer barbecue. He stared at it for a long beat. "This one's missing someone," he said. "We'll take a new one." I didn't smile. I just nodded. Not because everything was suddenly healed. Not because I forgave them entirely. But because I no longer needed to keep holding the pieces that used to hurt me. A month later, I returned to DC. I slipped back into my quiet life, a small apartment overlooking the Potomac, a part-time advisory role for NATO, early mornings, long briefings. The same routines that always steadied me. But something had shifted. Once a month, I taught a special course at Fort Campbell, soft strategy in non-traditional combat environments. Erica was always there. She sat in the front row. She asked hard questions. She debated with me. She pushed me. And sometimes, when I spoke about missions that once pulled us apart, she fell silent in a way that told me she was listening. One afternoon, after class, she handed me a thin binder. Inside was a training reform proposal based on the strategies I'd introduced. "I don't need your signature," she said. "I just need to know what you think." On the cover, I wrote one word: advance. Our family didn't move with fireworks or grand speeches. We moved in quiet ways. My mother sent handwritten notes now, usually short. "Are you eating enough?" she asked in the last one. My father told his friends his daughter was a strategic advisor, not somewhere overseas, but right here, shaping the future. The new family photo sat on the mantel. This time, I was in it. Not cropped out. Not replaced. At the end of one training session, a young cadet stayed behind. He was nervous, maybe 23. "Ma'am," he asked, "in war, what's the hardest part?" I paused. "Surviving," I said, without becoming a statue. That evening, I walked the perimeter behind the barracks as the sun dipped low in a golden haze. Erica appeared beside me, holding a small birthday cake in a plastic container. 3 words were written on top in blue icing. General. Sister. Teacher. I didn't need applause. I didn't need history books to remember my name. I just needed to be seen. And finally, I was. Rebuilding doesn't come with blueprints. There's no checklist, no timeline. It happens in small, unspoken gestures, often when you're not even sure anyone else is paying attention. Our family didn't explode back into each other's lives. There was no grand reunion, no loud forgiveness. It was quieter than that. More cautious. More real. My mother started writing to me. Not emails. Not texts. Handwritten notes, mailed in pale blue envelopes. She always used the same careful script, the one she'd used on birthday cards when I was a kid. The notes were short, sometimes just a sentence. "Are you eating enough? How's the weather in DC?" Once, she asked if I'd found a good pair of walking boots. I never wrote back. But I kept every letter. My father's change came slower, but it came. He started mentioning me in conversations with his old military friends. Not as the daughter who disappeared into intelligence. Not as the ghost. But as the strategic advisor who sat on NATO briefings. As the instructor shaping the next wave of officers. He didn't brag. He just placed me back into the story, like he'd finally realized there was space for me. Erica showed up to every one of my classes at Fort Campbell. Front row. Notebook open. She didn't sit quietly either. She challenged me. She questioned my tactics. She pushed back on the scenarios I presented. And when the lessons touched on missions we both knew too well, she went still. She listened in the way people listen when they're ready to understand, not just respond. One afternoon, after a long session on asymmetric conflict, she stayed behind. She handed me a thin binder. Inside was a training reform proposal, structured around some of the ideas I had introduced in class. "I don't need your approval," she said. "I just want your perspective." I read it carefully. Her work was solid. Thoughtful. I picked up a pen and wrote one word on the cover. Advance. She didn't smile. She just nodded, like that was enough. Our family was moving, not loudly, not quickly, but steadily. The old family photo on the mantel had been quietly replaced with a new one. This time, I wasn't cropped out. I wasn't missing. The picture wasn't perfect. We weren't standing too close. But we were all there. And that was enough. One evening, as the bass settled into its usual rhythm, a young cadet lingered after class. Nervous, still green around the edges. "Ma'am," he asked, "what's the hardest part about war?" I didn't give him the answer printed in textbooks. "Surviving," I said, "without turning your wounds into weapons. Without becoming a statue." He nodded, but I could tell the weight of it would only really hit him years later. That night, as the sun sank low over the training fields, Erica walked up beside me. No words, just easy silence. She held out a small plastic container, its lid slightly askew. Inside was a birthday cake, small, imperfect, but hers. 3 words were written in blue icing across the top. General. Sister. Teacher. I didn't need applause. I didn't need history books to write my name. I just needed to be seen. And I was. That's the thing about family. Sometimes they see you too late. Sometimes they miss entire chapters. Sometimes they fail you over and over. But sometimes, if you leave the door cracked just enough, they find their way back. It doesn't mean the past disappears. It doesn't erase the nights I ate by the sink while someone else took my seat at the table. It doesn't undo the years I spent surviving wars they never cared to ask about. But it does mean the story isn't finished. Our story now moves in small ways. Erica emails me more often now. Not out of obligation, but because she actually wants to hear what I think. She challenges my opinions and sends me articles she thinks I'll argue with. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I don't. My mother still writes her quiet notes. They never ask for anything. They just arrive, folded neatly, like they're trying to make space without demanding it. My father sometimes calls. Not to solve problems. Just to tell me about the new recruits he's mentoring, about the history books he's finally getting around to reading. The sharp edges have dulled. The silences aren't so heavy anymore. When I visit, there's a chair waiting for me. No one else's name is taped to it. No one has to give it up. It's just mine. And that's the kind of space you stop chasing when you realize you already belonged there all along. The hardest battles aren't the ones fought across borders. They aren't the ones etched into briefing slides or captured in tactical reports. The hardest battles are the quiet ones, the ones you fight when the room goes silent, when no one's watching, when the only opponent left is your own reflection. People think war is about territory. They think it's about strategy, about who commands the loudest, about who takes the hill first. But war has a softer terrain, the moral ground, the weight of the choices you have to live with long after the last bullet is fired. The older I got, the more I realized surviving wasn't the end game. The real fight was surviving without turning to stone. Surviving without letting the scars harden into walls so tall no one could ever climb them. I used to think silence meant I'd lost. That if my story wasn't told, I'd disappear. But sometimes silence is where strength builds. Sometimes the choice to stay quiet isn't surrender, it's self-respect. I didn't need to win my family back with medals. I didn't need them to understand every deployment, every mission, every classified order that shaped who I became. What I needed was simpler. I needed them to stop editing me out of the story. And eventually, they did. Erica and I never had the movie-ending reconciliation. There was no tearful embrace, no perfect apology that wrapped everything in a neat bow. What we had was honesty. We had questions that didn't get easy answers. We had the kind of quiet respect that grows when you finally see someone as they are, not as who you need them to be. She stopped needing to outshine me. I stopped needing to prove anything to her. One afternoon, after one of my classes at Fort Campbell, she stayed behind. She'd been challenging me hard in those sessions, pushing me, poking holes in my scenarios, not letting me settle into comfortable answers. She handed me a folder, thin but deliberate. Inside was a draft proposal for a training reform she'd been working on. "I don't need your approval," she said. "Just your thoughts." She wasn't asking for validation. She was asking for honesty. So I gave it. On the cover, I wrote one word: advance. It was her turn now. To lead. To write her own version of what leadership should look like. Not the one we'd been raised to follow. Not the rigid structure of medals and ranks and who stands tallest. Something better. Something real. My father, too, softened in his own way. He started telling his friends about me, not the daughter who vanished into classified work, but the daughter who shaped strategy, who taught the next generation, who earned her place without needing anyone else to say so. My mother kept sending her notes, always in the same blue envelopes, always in that careful handwriting that made them feel like they belonged in the quiet parts of the story. She didn't need to write essays. Sometimes the simplest question held the most weight. Are you eating enough? Are you sleeping? Are you still walking in the mornings? There's something about being seen in those small ways that does more than 1,000 public salutes ever could. Our family's pace changed. The sharp edges dulled. The weight of years spent walking parallel finally settled into something that looked like walking side by side. I no longer needed to hold on to the anger. I didn't need the applause. I didn't need the history books to carve my name into their pages. What I needed was smaller, quieter. I needed to sit at the table and not feel like I'd borrowed the chair. And finally, I did. In one of my last training sessions of the season, a young cadet stayed behind after class. He was nervous, still wearing his green around the edges, still trying to figure out how to stand in his own boots. "Ma'am," he asked in war, "what's the hardest part?" I didn't pause this time. "Surviving without becoming a statue," I told him. "Not turning your wounds into weapons." His shoulders relaxed like that was an answer he hadn't expected, but maybe one he needed. That evening, as the base settled into the hush of late afternoon, Erica appeared beside me. No words. Just quiet company. She handed me a small birthday cake in a plastic container. The writing on top was a little crooked, the icing slightly smudged. 3 words written in blue. General. Sister. Teacher. The titles didn't matter as much anymore. History didn't sting like it used to. What mattered was that they finally saw me, not as a ghost, not as a failure, not as a shadow to be cropped out. Just as me. Some battles leave no scars on your skin but carve canyons in your soul. Some victories don't need parades. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay, when walking away would have been easier. And sometimes, in the smallest, quietest ways, that's how you win. Sometimes the deepest wounds don't come from battlefields, they come from the silence of the people we love. This story reminds us that being unseen by your own family can cut deeper than any enemy's weapon. Many of us, especially as we grow older, carry scars that no one else can see. We chase approval from those who have already written us out of their story. But the greatest lesson here is simple. Your worth does not need permission. Your value is not tied to applause or family traditions. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to keep showing up, even when no one's looking for you. To hold your place at the table without waiting to be invited. We learn that leadership is not about who speaks the loudest or who stands the tallest. It's about who carries their burdens with quiet strength, who chooses understanding over pride, and who keeps their heart open when it would be easier to shut it down. Life's hardest battles often have no medals, no fanfare, but they shape who we truly are. If this story touched you, If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, please consider subscribing to this channel, sharing this story with someone who might need to hear it, and leaving a comment. Your voice matters. Sometimes, just knowing someone is listening makes all the difference. Let's build a space where no one is forgotten.